So now we're going to talk about the components of feedback and what feedback is, and in particular we'll talk about augmented feedback. And augmented feedback is essentially some sort of feedback that's done between instructor and students, or some type of feedback about the process or the outcome of things that are wanting to be improved upon, or locations that need to be targeted, right? And so there are many forms of augmented feedback, and we'll talk about that moving forward. But so really, where does feedback come? And when does it come? And there could be before, during, or after the action. And there's many mechanisms by which we use feedback to let us know. Oftentimes there's sensory input before and during the action. And those are really some of the internal feedbacks that we utilize from our body positioning. And those are some inherent and intrinsic feedbacks in the process. And then oftentimes we use this feedback that happens after or is completed. And we can use this by the completion of the task or how we are, but also by some sort of mechanism looking at the completion or how we perform the task. And so augmented is more of an extrinsic feedback versus the intrinsic feedback, where it comes from our body positioning and where things are, and really about the sensory information about our movement system. So understand there's two big, broad classes of feedback: the inherent and augmented. Inherent is that intrinsic, and then augmented is some sort of extrinsic feedback that we provided, oftentimes by a coach or somebody teaching us how to do something. So what is inherent feedback, and what does information you gain regarding your own movements via these sensory mechanisms? Oftentimes this feedback is very rich and varied, but there's a substantial amount of information that occurs in your performance. Very often it's unconscious in its ability or idea to process the feedback for us. And then some aspect is either signaled immediately, or it's a clearly defined and recognizable evaluation of the process. And then we have the augmented feedback, and this is provided by some sort of supplemental or augmented ability through video, via instruction, via photos, via outcome scores, some sort of idea that is supplemental to that inherent feedback of what you feel, right? There are many dimensions to augmented feedback. When? Is it concurrent or terminal? Is it immediately or delayed? That's the time component. What kind of mode? Is it a verbal or non-verbal? Are you watching a video or somebody giving instruction? And then how much, the amount, and is it accumulated or distinct? And here's a table that I want you to look at and understand. And if we go back down, right, so it's very important that we notice that augmented feedback can come in the form of knowledge of results or knowledge of performance, and then understand that, right? So you have concurrent or terminal, presented after the movement or during the movement. There's immediate or delayed. Is it presented immediately after you completed the task, or do they let some time go so you can do some internal processing in your own mind, your own analysis? Is it verbal or is it non-verbal, right? And so is this watching the video and nobody saying anything to you, or somebody giving you some verbal instructions on what you did? The accumulated is feedback that's represented in accumulation of past performance, so group. And distinct is after individual tasks are completed or trials are completed. Accumulated is also known as summary. So the knowledge of results, right? So there's verbal terminal feedback about the outcome. This is the key component, is the outcome of the movement in terms of the environmental goal. So did you achieve your goal? You missed the ball, you missed the target. And so that is really, and you could say you missed the target to the northwest or by 2 inches or whatever it is. But you need to know what the environmental goal is and what was the outcome. Knowledge of results is feedback about whether or not your outcome was relative to the task, and then feedback about the movement, not about the movement itself. With knowledge of performance, it's talking about some sort of pattern in your motion that was maybe correct or not correct, and talking about your elbows too high in release, or the positioning of the ball. It's very important to notice that knowledge of performance can come in both the external and internal cues. And that may be one thing that you want to focus on too as you deal with knowledge of performance, is whether or not you're using the body and internal cues versus external cues and which one is more effective in the process. So knowledge of performance is about the pattern itself. It's more related to the feedback given by the instructor as opposed to the intrinsic feedback felt by the individual performing it. And then it also can provide information about certain aspects that some sort of coach or person analyzing and helping train or conduct may want the learner to focus on. And those are very key components of identifying areas of interest. From a research perspective, we know that knowledge of results and knowledge of performance guide learners to the goal of movement. They can help error correction and error identification. It's seen as neutral for an information learner using the correct use to correct the errors. But now feedback has an effect on the learner's motivation, and we know that there's a performance and learning effect on the type of augmented feedback given and the way that it is given, right? And so what we want to do with the feedback, especially the knowledge of performance and knowledge of results, is be very cautious of how we do it and direct the learner's attention to certain aspects of movement. If we give too much feedback and have them identify too many variables or too many components of their movement pattern that they want to be improved upon, that may be detrimental to both performance and learning through a motivation. So this just describes a little bit of very traditional knowledge of results protocol, and the idea that, so you have a knowledge of performance of one, so you complete the first movement task, there's a little bit of a delay in time, and then the knowledge of results is given. Then you have a period of time where the individual processes, and then they perform movement 2. So this is your traditional view of knowledge of results. Understand that the inertial intertrial interval is the time between movement 1 and movement 2. Within that, there is a component in time where they are given their knowledge of results. And so this just shows a little bit of the benefits of the number of trials in between getting the knowledge of results and how the absolute error is affected by that. And the idea with this is that there may be a greater benefit to allowing an individual to self-analyze and self-correct and not get the knowledge of results all the time. And this is allowing them to get the knowledge of results after 19 versus 2 trials and then continue the process. So as they show improvements through the process with the number of results they were given. So there's no improvement without knowledge of results, right? So the knowledge of results up here, so they need to have some idea of what it was. There's a progressive improvement with knowledge of results as they go through the process. And so this is when the knowledge of results was removed from the study. So they were able to see the knowledge of results for the first couple of trials, for the first 6 trials, for the first 19 trials. So this individual was able to use the knowledge of results to help better improve their learning. Here is a YouTube video for you to go ahead and check out, and this is about batting response, but again, it's the idea of the use of knowledge of results and how beneficial it is in the process to help you correct your movement pattern from an individual perspective. Without knowledge of results, it's hard for us to kind of correct our own ability, and we can maybe learn how to achieve a better result by having some sort of identification or understanding of how we're performing. Now, talking about knowledge of performance, we're going to first talk about the video. And video is a very useful tool, but there's some caveats to it. By itself, video analysis and using for the knowledge of performance and how people completed the task can be detrimental. And it's detrimental to learning and performance because there's a possibility of information overload and there being too much information given to the individual, therefore they're trying to correct too many tasks in the same time. So what we need to do is, if you are using video in order to help somebody improve their motor pattern, is you need to cue them. And the cueing is the ability to direct or guide where you want the focus of attention to be. What certain aspects of the video in the knowledge of performance feedback do you want them to focus on? And so what we do know is that combining this visual knowledge and performance with other augmented feedbacks are very effective. So if we can show the knowledge of results along with some of the video aspects and cue this individual, then we can focus and be more geared toward what we want them to work on. And so this is simply just one of the studies in Kernodle in them. I will go ahead and post this up so you can see this. But the idea is there's 50 practice trials per practice session, 600 total practice trials, and it's really a 4-week period of time. So it's a lengthy period of time in which they did. So you can see knowledge of results, knowledge of performance, which is the videotape on a throwing pattern they did not see in this situation, how they ended up or what happened. And then there's a knowledge of performance with the cue. So this was following the knowledge of performance. They were cued before watching it. So before they watched the video, they were told what to look for. But then there was also a knowledge of performance transition. Now, this is they were given suggestive improvements to focus on following the knowledge of performance. So this was really where coaching occurs, right? You have them analyze something and you tell them what to focus on. Now, this is going to be based on that 1 to 10 scale baseball that we've seen in the previous literatures going forward and looking at baseball throwing pattern. So here is that knowledge of performance scale and what we should focus on and really about the styles of throwing properly. And then you can see that through the testing sessions, there was absolutely the greatest improvement in transition. Now, this is mean distance, so this is how far they were able to throw. The cueing also improved greatly, and then knowledge of performance was actually worse than knowledge of results. Now, remember, the knowledge of performance had no idea how far they were throwing the ball, so they had no real idea on how to improve. If we look at over here, mean distance thrown for the 4 as a function of testing, this is actually how far, right? So this is the distance gain, and this is actually how far they threw. Well, the knowledge of results started throwing pretty far because they could see the results going forward. It took a little longer for the transition to improve, but in the overall scheme of everything, they improved the most. Notice that the knowledge of performance simply just the knowledge of performance had the least amount of gain in the process. So think about what this is telling us and what the importance of is between transition, between cueing, and then the two between knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. It is very important for us to understand the importance of having and combining knowledge of performance with knowledge of results in the process. Just another way for it to be, the data to be demonstrated going forward, I'm going to post this paper for you as well on VBLearn. So then when we look at knowledge of performance, in addition to the video, there are a couple other things that we can talk about. There's kinematic, and this is talking about position, velocity, acceleration, patterns of coordination. This is more the biomechanical as well as the kinetic. In the kinetic, we can look at the measurement of forces and have a display of a real time of the force, ground reaction forces, and that can be used as a feedback during performance. And then you also have biofeedback, and that's biological processes electronically. We can do VO2, we can do electromyography, and these are all different components of biofeedback that we can allow to be seen and used as feedback. The precision of knowledge of feedback is the feedback does not always need to be exact, and this is a very important component. Sometimes you do not need to know exactly how much the individual missed completely. If the target was missed by 10 centimeters, what are some ways that we can give that knowledge of results? And that is very important because sometimes if we give too precise of information, then they try to overcorrect, especially as that number is moving down. 10 centimeters is pretty big, but if it's 1 centimeter, do we need to tell them it's 1 centimeter? Or we can just say it's you almost made it. And so the idea is this qualitative versus quantitative, and then bandwidth and erroneous, and we'll talk about what those are right now. So this qualitative versus quantitative is this idea that maybe we just need to say, hey, you were right or you were wrong, or you were right by this much or wrong by this much, right? So if I gave a number to how much you were right or wrong, that is the quantitative. If I said, hey, you were right or wrong, or you missed left, you missed right, or too far, too short, those are the qualitatives. Understand that there is that ceiling effect. So if I get too close from a quantitative, then it's going to be important that we try to maybe switch to the qualitative goal. But just understand the difference of the two. Then we have a bandwidth, and understand that movement goal generates this bandwidth of acceptable. So understanding that if we make this correct or right idea, that we use this range of when we're going to give feedback. And if they're within that range, we don't give them any feedback. If they're outside of that range, then we want to go ahead and give them feedback, right? So sometimes if we're playing and we're shooting at a bullseye, if we're within a certain area, we're like, we don't give that feedback of the knowledge results because they're within it. If they're too far out of that bandwidth, then we want to say, then we give them a time or a distance at which they were missing. What we do know is that there are greater effects on learning with a larger bandwidth. That means that we've accepted a larger range at which they are being able to self-analyze and self-report without giving the knowledge of results. There is not a known optimal bandwidth, and it changes across different tasks. But what happens to that frequency as the bandwidth increases of knowledge of results? And that's going to be an important component. Erroneous is incorrect knowledge of results. So do we say that you were right when you were wrong? Or do we say you were too far when you were actually too short? There's an increased quantity of erroneous knowledge of results shown to have a negative consequence in the performance.